The Cuban Missile Crisis was a very important time in the U.S. history because the crisis caused everyone, whether you were a Soviet or an American, to know that nuclear war was a big threat. The Cuban Missile Crisis was the climax of the Cold War because most of the tensions started to ease. The following documentary is summarizing the events of the Cuban Missile Crisis and why the crisis is such an important event in American history. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a very unstable time in the U.S. history. John F. Kennedy was elected president a little less than 2 years from the crisis. About 6 months later, President Kennedy attempts to overthrow the communist government and assassinate Fidel Castro, the leader of Cuba. President Kennedy does this by invading a small bay on the south side of Cuba, the Bay of Pigs. The Bay of Pigs invasion was thwarted by Fidel Castro's army and failed miserably. 84.9% of the U.S. soldiers were taken prisoner or killed during the invasion. The Bay of Pigs caused Fidel Castro to turn to Nikita Khrushchev for defense against the U.S. 27,305 nuclear warheads ready to be launched at any second by the U.S., and approximately 4,000 warheads ready to be launched by Russia. The outnumbering of these nuclear warheads shows how the U.S. was ready for anything. Although the USSR had few warheads during the Cuban Missile Crisis, they certainly didn't stop making them after this nuclear crisis. In fact, around 1986, the USSR had about 40,000 missiles and were ready for anything. It certainly wouldn't be smart to mess with Russia then. It was October 20th, 1962, when right before JFK was scheduled to end a tour of the U.S. at the Century 21 Exposition in Seattle, he bowed out. The press secretary for Kennedy made it public that he had come down with a cold and was going back to Washington, D.C. immediately. After hearing that JFK was coming down with a cold, the Century 21 Exposition asked Vice President Lyndon Johnson to possibly take Kennedy's role. But apparently Johnson also appeared to have a cold. These colds were obviously lies to get back to the White House. The Cold War was a very stressful time for the Americans and Russians alike. The Cold War was not named after a physical cold, but rather the icy relationship between the two countries. Everyone feared the possible threat of the nuclear war. The U.S. became very scared when the USSR put Sputnik into the atmosphere. The citizens thought that the USSR was spying on them and became more threatened. The U.S. feared this because now they could possibly put missiles in space. No one wanted this because the U.S. would have to watch their back from space and from Cuba. The USSR and Cuba were covertly making missile bases in Cuba while the U.S.'s back was turned. The USSR was putting ballistic missiles in the missile bases. The code name for this operation was Operation Anadir. The plan was to put 50,000 people on ships to Cuba to help with the missiles and defense. The USSR used a war strategy called Maskarava. Part of the strategy was to use denial and deception. The U.S. only finds out about the bases on October 14, 1962, when an American U-2 spy plane flies over Cuba and takes pictures of the missile bases in Cuba. On October 16, 1962, President Kennedy met with his advisors to make a strategy. The advisors that Kennedy met with was a group specifically made for the Cuban Missile Crisis. This group was known as the XCOM. After many XCOM meetings, Executive Communications of the National Security Council, the U.S. finally came to an agreement. The choices were an airstrike or a naval blockade. The Council chose the naval blockade because the airstrike did not guarantee the 100% destruction of the missiles. 6 days after the XCOM meetings, the U.S. sent out ships to the northeast of Cuba to stop the Soviet ships from entering. The quarantine was violating the international law, stating that the world's oceans can be used to transport objects and to trade. Doing this was an act of war, and the USSR made sure that the U.S. realized that. A letter that Khrushchev sent to Kennedy says, "You are not declaring a quarantine, but rather issuing an ultimatum." This means that Nakata does not like to be pushed around and that this was illegal. The U.S. went to extreme measures to keep the Soviet aircrafts out of the sky. One of the U.S.'s tricks to keep the planes out of the air was to order planes to fly in the sky. This created lots of air traffic, stopping some of the Cuban aircrafts. This was crucial to the success of the naval blockade and to the successful end to the Cuban Missile Crisis. On October 27, 1962, a Soviet submarine was hit by a depth charge from a U.S. ship, signaling the submarine to come up. The submarine was too deep to communicate with the ships above and thought that the war had started. The captain and political officer voted to launch a nuclear torpedo as strong as the bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. Vasily Arkhipov voted against launching the torpedo and stopped the catastrophe. On October 27, 1962, Rudolf Anderson was flying through the stratosphere on a reconnaissance mission. His mission was to do another survey of Cuba. This was an extremely dangerous mission because the surface-to-air missiles were fully operational. As soon as Rudolf entered the Cuban airspace, his U-2 spy plane instantly showed up on the Cuban radar. After an hour of flying around in the air, the lieutenant general gave the order to shoot down the unarmed plane. The shrapnel most likely killed him instantly, but if not, he would fall 72,000 feet to his demise. In the end, both of the sides offered a compromise. Khrushchev offered to get rid of the bases in Cuba around the same time that President Kennedy offered to take out the Jupiter missiles in Turkey and Italy. The UN had to inspect Cuba for the bases after the compromise. This is a very peculiar compromise because most have only one side compromising. The 13-day period that was the Cuban Missile Crisis was ended when Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy's brother, made a compromise with a Soviet ambassador. The tension between the two governments started to ease in 1963. The time to fix the roof is when the sun is still shining, John F. Kennedy. This quote is from President Kennedy, and it shows you that the best time to change or fix something is when you still have the opportunity. President Kennedy does just this by ending the Cuban Missile Crisis and fixing the conflict between the U.S., Cuba, and Russia.